Hi, everybody. Welcome to another YouTube channel on Mediation and Beyond. And today I am so excited to have again Galit Romanelli from Israel. And she is a coach, a mom, wife. She works with her husband at Potential State. So check them out on potentialstate.com. And Galit and I did a series a while ago on divorce as the child of divorce, now as a mother of children, and divorced child who's now a wife. And so I brought Galit back on because she is also founder of M.Other Milk. And so if you look at that, it's mom for the acronym. But she started this because she began her very personal story about the overwhelming emotions that followed giving birth. And she heard that every birthing story is different. And so she was prepared for the unexpected. You know, it'd be great if you could. That's what we're going to talk about today, being prepared for the unexpected. Nobody told her that every feeding story is different. Nobody shared that breastfeeding is not necessarily easy or pain-free. And certainly nobody told her that it's possible not to produce enough milk. She was completely unprepared and unaware, and hence, M.Other Milk was born. So Galit, thank you for coming on today. It's so good to see you again.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me, Colleen. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, and I love our complementary colors that we didn't even know we were doing.
Yes, holidays, season.
Right? So thanks for coming on. So we're going to do another series. So we did the divorce one, which I thought went really well. Thank you for that. Now we're going to do another one on really being a mom. So from the beginning part of it. And so today we're going to do a three-part series again. Our first one will be on choice and agency and identity and transition into motherhood. Our second one will be on intimacy after birth with our partner, that is. And then our last one will be on support and information. So let's just start off because I want people to follow,
Yeah.
Let's start off with the first one we spoke about, which is that choice and agency and identity while we're transitioning into motherhood. So we give birth and
Yeah, and I think that not enough space is actually given for the enormity of that experience of this transition into motherhood and birth. And I think that there are a lot of ideals and kind of these images that we when we speak about motherhood that we see in terms of, oh, you're handed your baby and then there's this magical loving bond that kind of happens instantly. And I think I'll speak to my experience mostly, but definitely part of what I've heard and gathered through my work with Mother Milk is that that's not necessarily true for many women. And the experience isn't just this, smooth, graceful transition into motherhood. And many times the identity and transition into motherhood takes time. A mother is born when your baby is born. And what does that look like? And identities are formed over time. And I think that there's a lot of pressure when we don't talk about these other experiences, when we don't kind of surface that for some women, there isn't an instant bond. And for some women, they kind of feel this loss of self. I actually just participated in this amazing writing workshop last night, and it was about loss. And one woman spoke about, there's a deep kind of sense of loss sometimes for who you were before, and you're stepping into this enormous unknown of what you will be like and what your relationship with your child will be like and how it changes your marriage, which we'll talk about in the next one. But if we don't kind of speak about these things, then I know that for many women, and I know for myself, there was a deep sense of kind of loneliness. And there's also this sense of shame or judgment or fear that something's wrong, that you haven't transitioned properly, that, I remember after having tzach, he was taken away from me fairly quickly because they needed, he was born early and they needed to give him oxygen. And I remember when they kind of wheeled me in to see him, thinking to myself, like, I don't know who this little creature is. Like, I don't,
Yes.
there was this very strange, almost out of body kind of experience of like, what am I supposed to do now? Who is this? The doctors are like watching me. I mean, but I didn't feel this sense of connection immediately.
That's
Um,
okay.
right. And that's okay. And
No
I
one,
think that the
no one
more
tells
we,
you that.
right, exactly. No one tells you that. And, nobody wants to be the first to kind of like whisper and like, I didn't feel anything for my baby. Like, is that not, but I think it's really important that that women n- know that that is normal, that that is okay, that it does take time, like any relationship. It's a bond that forms over time, and it's not something that's instantaneous. And I think that kind of knowledge and beginning to speak about these things will, I would hope, kind of really give women,
Permission.
right,
I mean,
permission to voice, permission to feel the feelings, permission to express them without feeling judged or shamed. Um,
well, I think for women, a lot of times I don't care what age you are and what stage of life you're in, we're not very honest.
right,
We're with each other.
right,
We're not like, you sit around and if I'm sitting at a table talking about birthing experiences, I'll tend to be quiet because I shared with you before I had a really great birthing experience. But everybody else, so I'm lying to everybody else. I'm just being silent. I'm not participating. I'm not going to tell you because I feel like you're supposed to go along with everybody had a miserable experience,
right,
or everybody
right,
had a great breastfeeding experience, right? And so if
right,
you didn't, you're not going to like. I think there has to be
right.
space
It
for all
it's
our
funny.
experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because you kind of feel like, well, if you had too easy a birth, and like, oh, well, don't like show off, and it's
Which you're not. You're sharing your
right.
experience.
Right, exactly. What does that even mean? And I think that the more we share, the more we would be able to see that the experiences are so vast, right? Like, and yet there is kind of a common thread, and we can still, every experience can resonate with us, and every experience can enable us to gain empathy. And then we'll be able to slowly um, kind of soften this judgment and this shame that surrounds the transition into motherhood or infant feeding. And in terms of kind of choice, I know that for me, I think that sometimes in the conversation about infant feeding, we forget as women and as mothers that we have a choice. I think that the images that we see and the way the conversation is very much like there's a hierarchy. And there's a hierarchy with birth, with like natural being the best ideal way, and the same goes for the way we speak about infant feeding, where like exclusive breastfeeding is the ideal, the cream of the crop kind of thing. And I think that we forget that there's choice. There's with birth there's as much choice as possible, because some things really are out of our hands. And also with infant, with the infant feeding journey. But I think that if we can try and remember that there is an element of choice, or at least in our narrative kind of own a perspective of choice, then we will feel like we own the story and it is ours, and we have more agency.
But
And
what's interesting is how that choice is delivered. So
yeah,
if you're in a class with your husband and you're like, you're doing before your baby's born, the classes.
right,
I think just the tone from the
yeah,
presenter, so you may be like, they may spend, a lot more time on breastfeeding than they do. Well, if you're going to not breastfeed, try to pick a good
right,
formula. Okay.
right, exactly,
But you can spend
exactly,
3 hours on breastfeeding.
right, exactly. And all these kind of very nuanced messages give us a message that like, well, if you want to be a good mother, and this also speaks to the kind of this
Identity.
identity of like what a good mother is and what does a good mother do. And a good mother exclusively breastfeeds. Well, my identity as a motherhood has nothing to do with whether or not I breastfed or not. And I think that what we actually need to start speaking about is that a good mother is a mother who is in at an intersection and is able to quiet the shoulds and the and all the noises and really focus on what is best for her and her baby and her family. And that's really hard. Those are the intersections that determine, whether you're a good mother and whether you're doing what's right for you and your baby. And that's where I think the focus should be. And we should be given, when we speak about information, but when the conversation is more expansive and when we're able to kind of hear that there are many options and there are many choices and things can go one way or the other, and it doesn't mean that you're not a good mother,
Yes.
then we can, I think then we'll be able to kind of much more easily and gracefully move into transition, because there won't be this pressure or burden of like, am I doing, we haven't even started, are we already doing it wrong? Have we already gotten it wrong because, we didn't have the ideal birth? Did we already get it wrong because we're giving formula this one time?
Or all
And
the time.
right, or all the time. Right, right,
I mean, you can pain your way through infant feeding with using your breast, right?
right,
And then disconnect from your baby, or
right,
you can give yourself a break, give the baby some formula, and really
right.
focus on that connection and take some stress off yourself, right?
Absolutely.
And
Right. And
honor yourself.
yeah, and it's not a zero-sum game, which is something that I wish I had known. I was so fearful. There was this constant kind of voice or message that I was getting, whether it was true or not, it's not. But that, well, if you give formula, even just one time, then there'll be nipple confusion, and then the baby, you'll reduce your chances for successfully breastfeeding. But in the meantime, I was so stressed. I like completely lost sight of the fact that there was a baby. I was so adamant to just breastfeed. And I was so afraid that one bottle would mean that that was it. I had ruined my chances to exclusively breastfeed and therefore be a bad mother, that I lost track of what was really important. Not to mention the fact that I think that actually what's interesting is that had I known that it's not all or nothing, right? That combo feeding is a wonderful option, then I could have at the end of the day felt like, wow, I'm having my cake and eating it too.
Right. Yes. And isn't it
And
at the end of the day, don't you want to just know that your baby's healthy and fed?
yeah,
And
exactly.
that's a good mom.
Right, right.
Instead of a
Absolutely.
stressed
Absolutely.
out instead of a stressed out mother.
Right, right. And I feel a lot of times when we find ourselves in situations where it's either this or that,
Yeah.
then we know that we're in a tricky place. And I feel like, unfortunately, with the transition into motherhood, many times, especially at the beginning, when we're anyway so vulnerable, when we're anyway so emotional, when we're anyway so, exhausted,
Yeah.
that we very quickly find ourselves in these situations where it's either this or that. And that's how we kind of view our situation. And it is important that the people around us and that the images that we see, are able to remind us that
Right.
everything is an option, and you have choices, and you're not, it's not either one way and that's it, you've blown it.
Right. It's not one size fits all. Right.
Right,
It just,
right,
it just is, and that's okay.
right,
Right.
right.
So when you're saying, I just want to go back to identity for a minute.
Yeah,
When you talk about identity as a mom, right? You get this baby, it's placed on your chest or in your arms, and then you're a mom.
right.
And so, what was that like for you? Like, what was your experience? Because the word mom has so many connotations to it.
Right. Yeah, it's huge. Um, I think I was one of kind of the later friends to get, like, one of the last one of my friends to have a baby. So I had kind of like watched on the side, and I thought that I was, older, ready, but man, I wasn't. I wasn't. There was nothing graceful about my transition into motherhood by any means. I found it extremely kind of frazzling. And I very much identify with this notion of kind of a loss of your past identity or who you were, right?
And
There were a
freedom.
lot of moments, yeah, your freedom, totally, absolutely. And not to mention the fact that um you kind of feel out of sorts,
Yeah.
you're really not who you were. And I think that what's interesting is that for me, with my eldest, everything, it's always new, it's always a first. What worked 3 months ago, even now, even with him being 9, is still, it's still new, it's still. And my identity, I think, as the mom, continues to change and continues to kind of evolve and grow. um and so,
You're
and
just
I think,
frazzled in a different way.
right, exactly, totally. But I think that what really kind of helped me was to speak a lot about this change and how, what I felt I was going through, and what I felt I was kind of missing from my past, and how this kind of transition had changed who I was and wanted to be. And it's also with like very small things. I remember that for me, especially because the infant feeding journey was so challenging for me, um, and I was on this really intense routine of kind of, when he was awake, I would breastfeed, and when he wasn't, I would pump, and then I would try, like this constant. So I couldn't even leave the house.
Cycle.
I wasn't, right. I wasn't even, and I think that that also has a huge impact, because I remember there were all kinds of mommy groups and things like that, which in theory are great and supportive because you can speak to other moms. But when you're feeling like things aren't going well for you or aren't right for you, and it's not necessarily a conversation that you are having yet with other moms, or it's not something that's out in the open, then you feel like, oh, well, I don't want to go and hang out with moms that are doing better than me.
Yep.
So I
Absolutely.
think
Well,
it's
it makes you
really,
feel less than.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that it's really important, and that women know that, their experiences are normal, and that to verbalize it or finds outlets. And also, I find that what may help the with the transition is to really take time to celebrate the gravity of this experience. Birth is a huge deal. Like, it's a really big deal. And yet somehow we're not speaking about it and celebrating it nearly enough, in my opinion. Like, anybody that would listen, I would tell my birthing story to. Even today, I'm like, I want to tell it to everybody, because, and I think that there's so much empowerment in sharing those stories, because whether it was an emergency C-section, or whether it was, a natural birth, you were powerful. You were powerful in that moment. You were part of the creation of life.
Yeah. Well, you know what I love about that is because, and you and I are different ages. We're not going to say who's older. However, but there's wisdom. So
Right.
now you're at a different stage where people, like, let's say my daughter was on here, you'd be able to share your wisdom. I
Yeah.
share my wisdom.
Yeah.
Then she gets to make her own choices. But it's like experience is powerful as long
Totally.
as you use it to benefit
Right.
somebody else.
Right.
And that's where I wish there was more of this sharing of legacy of birthing experiences and infant feeding experience, so that like, we'll put this video out and I hope people really sit and take it in, or share it with their daughter-in-law, or share it with their daughter or their son.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
let the
Absolutely.
men let the men know and understand that this is huge for us. It's not personal for what we're experiencing. If we're mean or having a bad day, isn't about them, it's about us because of what just happened. And
Right.
so, and that goes on to the next one, and we'll get into it then. But
Yeah.
I think the wisdom is what I'm really loving having this conversation, because that's what that's what's needed in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Colleen. I couldn't have said it better myself. Really. That resonates deeply. And I think that that's what it is. And I think that that's what we're kind of lacking, is that by not sharing, we're not passing on wisdom. We're not passing on, all the richness of each experience, and each experience needs to be spoken and celebrated and given space.
It does, because no two experiences are ever the same, just like no two births. Like you
Right,
were sharing earlier, no two births are the same. You had a different experience with your son as you did with your daughter. And so
right,
even in that,
right,
people will say, and I think I said it to you earlier, it's like, oh, well, if you have one child and it was like super easy, which kind of, you had an easier experience with your son, but then we're told, I remember being told, well, if you
right,
have a second child, it should be fine too. And that's not
right,
necessarily the case.
right, right.
And like with your daughter, and therein is the wisdom.
Absolutely right. And not just with birth, right? I'll also say that with infant feeding, I think that there's this misconception that, like, oh, well, you successfully breastfed your first child, so then you'll be totally fine the second time around. And it's not true. And with that also, I think it's really interesting that we forget also that with infant feeding, it's not just the mom, right? There are two units that have to come together to make it work. And I think that many times moms take a lot of guilt and shame upon themselves if they don't successfully breastfeed. But actually, there's a lot that has to make, successful breastfeeding come together. A lot of stars need to align, and your baby is one active participant in that. And if and they also have a stake. So, and I say that because I think that if we could start looking at it kind of that way as well, then moms wouldn't feel as much guilt or shame
Yes.
surrounding that, because it's not all on us. There are a lot of factors at play here.
Yeah, that's really important piece, that's very multi-layered and multifactorial, and that and there's no blame on who is what. It just is,
Right,
right? And
right,
you have to figure out the pieces of the puzzle to kind of make it align. And sometimes it just can't align.
right,
And
right,
that's okay too.
right.
Right? And there's that permission and that wisdom. So
Yeah,
thank you.
right.
This is great. So if you had to give a good solid tip for about entering motherhood, choice and agency, identity, what's one thing that there could be a really good takeaway, a pearl of wisdom, a nugget of wisdom, although I know there's a lot on your site and what you do, but if someone's watching this,
Oh, well, Colleen, I would say that there's richness and wisdom, and to really seek out and hear and then share your story, speak it, write it out, like really reflect on your birth and give it the space that it deserves. The your birthing experience and your infant feeding experience, and know that, whatever you chose or whatever the outcome was, you're great.
yeah,
You're great.
just because you're a mom
Yeah.
and you're a
Yeah.
woman, celebrating
Yeah.
a part of your womanhood, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, and I don't think that moms get told enough that they're doing great.
You think? Think?
I'm gonna have it tattooed on my
Right?
forehead.
Yes. Well, I think it's a great spot to end, and I appreciate it. And so, for those of you who are watching, obviously, lots of nuggets and good wisdom and hearing, and share your story with
Yeah,
up and coming moms, because they need it, even if they don't know they need it. It
right.
will really be. They can take away a nugget, and I hope they
And
do.
not just the good stuff, right? Don't shy away from the hard stuff.
Right, the hard, but
Yeah,
there's a balance in there, and they're gonna have their own story to create and then go on and share, and I think that's the
right,
whole point. Share, 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 right?
right.
So thank you so
100%.
much.
Thank you.
We will be doing our next segment in the series on intimacy after birth. That's not intimacy with your child, intimacy with the necessary partner, which is your partner, right? So
Yep.
let's cut now, and then we'll be back in a few. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Colleen, thank you.